Welcome to the Zen Gateway Dharma Talks, an introduction to the four foundations of mindfulness scripture. Hello and welcome to the Zen Gateway Dharma Talks. For this talk and for the next few talks, we're going to be looking at Sutra, one of the scriptures from the Pali Canon, which are some of the earliest teachings that were compiled and written down between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. We're looking at a sutra from what's called the Digha Nikaya. These are known as the long discourses of the Buddha. In the Pali Canon, there are what are known as 5 collections. Nikayas is the term that's used, and the Digha Nikaya is the name of one of those collections, known as the long discourses of the Buddha. And this is the 22nd of those discourses, or the 22nd scripture in that collection, and it's known as the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. And Satipatthana is often translated into English as foundations of mindfulness, and because there are 4 of them, the scripture itself is sometimes called the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which also describes the practice formulation that is in there already. Now, some people may be wondering, why is it that on a series of Zen-based Dharma talks on a Zen website, we are looking at this early scripture? And that is because in this scripture, which despite it being in the long discourses is in fact quite short, the Buddha lays out the whole of the practice of Buddhism, lays out the whole of the Buddhist path, the practice path. Not only the sitting meditation, but also what we call the daily life practice. And the daily life practice in Zen, sometimes this is referred to as a mindfulness practice, although there are some variations on this, just variations of emphasis perhaps. In fact, daily life practice, Zen practice, whether that's meditation on the cushion or in activities of the day in daily life, which is a 24/7 practice, is based on this sutta. It doesn't change, and that's what makes the Zen school a Buddhist school. Because the practices fundamentally rest on exactly the same, not only the same teachings, the Four Noble Truths, suffering I teach and the way out of suffering, but also on similar or same practices as well. So it's useful for us, to see that connection and not to see Zen in isolation, which it doesn't exist in isolation, at least not in its Chinese and Japanese context or in its Southeast Asian context. Therefore, it's perfectly legitimate, I would argue, to connect this back to the earlier teachings. So we're going to be, as I say, looking at this text. We'll explore a little bit the actual formula and the style and structure of the text, the way that it's the way that it actually looks, because I always try to encourage people to pick up the scriptures, whether it's the Pali Canon or whether it's the Mahayana Sutras, because they're there for a reason and they are of value. But because they're ancient texts, they can be a little bit difficult to get into. The style can be a little bit difficult at first, but there's a lot of reward and a lot of fruit that can be got from it. So, having said that, we are going to start with the first opening 3 or 4 paragraphs for today's talk. So, the Buddha starts by saying, "Thus have I heard." The sutra opens by saying, "Thus have I heard," and that term, "Thus have I heard," is how all the Buddhist scriptures open. It's almost like saying "once upon a time" in a fairy tale, and this really takes us back and reminds us that this was an oral tradition. So the Buddha spoke, gave talks, and that at a later time this was written down. And in fact, the oral tradition that it started off as, is shown because these sutras take a formulaic structure So they're very repetitive. And quite often when they're written down, and certainly when they're translated into English, some of that repetition has been cut out. You can see ellipses through some of the translations in English. And the reason for that repetition is because it's actually a mnemonic. It helps to remember the sutra which was recited orally. So thus have I heard. At one time the Blessed One, that's the Buddha, was living among the Kurus, who's the name of a particular tribe, at Kamasadama, a market town of the Kuru people. There the Blessed One addressed the monks thus: "Monks," and they replied to him, "Venerable Sir." So a common way that showing some a common way of address. And the Blessed One spoke as follows: "This is the sole way, monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destroying of pain and grief, for reaching the right path, for the realization of Nirvana, namely the four foundations of mindfulness." So just looking at that, we can just explore it a little bit. So here the Buddha says, "This is the sole way, monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destroying of pain and grief." Now, we remember that, of course, the whole of the Buddha's teachings have at their basis the overcoming of suffering. This is the first teaching that the Buddha gave, it's the second teaching the Buddha gave in his first sermon, the Four Noble Truths: the existence of suffering, the cause of suffering, the stopping of suffering, and the way that leads to the stopping of suffering. Well, he's about to tell us about this way that leads to the stopping of suffering. So that's the core of the Buddha's teachings, and that is what the whole of these practices is about. The realization and the stopping of suffering. And he says that this is the sole way as well. And so this is the claim that the Buddha is actually making. That and it's interesting here because the Buddha is often likened to being a physician, and his teaching is likened to being a medicine that's used for curing this illness, which is referred to as suffering and lamentation. The term is actually dukkha, and we've looked at that term previously, that the etymology of it is dukkha means bad space, and it refers to the space at the center of a wheel, and if that space at the center of the wheel is too small, then when you try and put it onto the axle of the cart, it will resist it, and that resistance is caused by that small space, which dukkha means a bad space. The space isn't fit for purpose, basically, and this gives us as a metaphor, gives us a clue as to how the Buddha views suffering. That suffering is caused by a resistance to the truth of life itself. When we are in accord with that truth, then we do not suffer in the same way as if we try to go against the truth of life. So this then couples the cause of suffering with the realization of the way things really are. And that perhaps now lays the groundwork for, it gives the raison d'etre for the teachings and practice that will follow. Now, he says this is the sole way, monks, for the purification of being. So this term purification, actually there is a verse in the very famous verse in the Dhammapada, which is a collection of the Buddha's sayings that is very common and very popular in the Buddhist world. And one of those sayings says to refrain from harm or evil, refrain from harm or unskillful actions, to do as much good as possible, to purify the heart. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas, and that was supposed to sum up and encapsulate the teaching of the Buddhas: to refrain from harm, to do good, to purify the heart. So what does this mean, to purify the heart? To purify the heart, in this case, and I always remember my own teacher, Venerable Myokyoni, always making this equivalent, saying when we read purification in the Buddhist sutras, we shouldn't think of it solely in the terms of a moral purification, that is a sort of goodness that is whiter than white. Actually, what it refers to is emptiness of self, because as we see in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha identifies the cause of suffering as attachment, and in particular, attachment to the notion of myself. And that notion of myself takes many, many, many different forms, which the sutras explore, in which the teachings explore, in which we explore also in our practice, both in mindfulness and also in sitting practice, in order to realize all the ramifications of what it means to have attachment to self. So purification means the realization of the delusion of I, which, because the Buddha called this I a delusion, that it was an appearance only. It had no fundamental or actual substantial existence. So when we read purification, we should read it in that sense, not just in the moral sense. For the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destroying of pain and grief. So these are obviously referring to that dukkha, to that suffering, which is the whole, as we've said, the whole raison d'etre of the Buddha's teachings and the Buddha's path, the way out of suffering. And again, it's this suffering is not just obviously physical suffering, such as illness or accident and physical that has a physical cause, but much more to a psychological attitude as well, and also to feeling. There's emotional pain, there's spiritual pain as well, and again, the emphasis here is very much on a feeling of distrust. A feeling of emptiness. A feeling that something is missing, a lack, and dukkha very much has this at its core, that there is this feeling of a lack in everything, and in my existence, and that as a result of this feeling of a lack, which may be unconscious, or it may be semi-conscious, or it may be conscious, because of this it gives rise to the desire to fill that lack, and thus we seek to acquire things. That lack gets projected out onto things, and one of the qualities of any desired object is that it comes with a feeling conviction that the acquisition of it will satisfy. And indeed, when we get something that we really want, we do feel satisfied. But that satisfaction is only partial, or it's only temporary, and then it wears off, and then that projection takes place again onto the next object of desire, which then I must also get. And that's actually, and also just to be clear, of course, desire can be the wish to acquire something, but it can also be the wish to get rid of something as well. So there may be a trait in myself, or there may be a look in myself that I don't like, and if only I can get rid of that, then everything will be all right. That's very typical. That's a very typical trait of desire, and we learn to look out for that trait. We learn to look out for the shape of that thought and the behavior that goes with that way of seeing and thinking as well. So this is all part of the exploration and the realization of the nature of suffering itself, how it is linked with desire, and how our behavior is constantly repeating and repeating and repeating. And this is why that wheel of life is so useful, that wheel that is constantly turning, 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 because it also has that shape of how desire leads us to repeat and repeat and repeat the same mistakes. And of course, until we've acquired a certain amount of wisdom whereby we can, as it were, recognize the patterns of behavior rather than being subsumed and driven by those same patterns, until we've realized the shape of those patterns, we cannot be released from them. Because we are investing all our energies into acquisition or getting rid of things. either wanting or not wanting is the way it's put. And whilst those things are still in the command seat, then there's no hope of really escaping from that vicious cycle. This is what the Buddha is pointing to, and this is what we will be coming across. And then he says, for the destruction of pain and grief, for reaching the right path, for the realization of Nibbana. Nibbana is the Pali term, Nirvana is the Sanskrit term, and nerve, both of these words arrives from a verb. In Sanskrit, the verb is nerve, meaning to extinguish or to blow out, like a candle, so like blowing out a candle. And what's being referred to here is the blowing out of what are called the kleshas. And the kleshas is a Sanskrit term that refers to the passions, or this emotionality as it is linked to the notion of I. Now, what this is referring to, we need to be very clear about this, because this also then has to be kept within the context of that rather curious Mahayana saying in the northern tradition that says the passions, the kleshas, are nirvana or nibbana, and nirvana is the passions as well. Sometimes it's put the passions of the Buddha nature, and Buddha nature is the passions. So here we're equating Buddha nature and nirvana, and obviously there's a link between the two. And what we're seeing here is not that the passions themselves are somehow fundamentally or essentially or inherently suffering, but that when they are allied to the delusion of a separate self, of an I, i.e. they are impure, then they become the passions of greed, hatred, and the delusion of I. And these three, greed or wanting, hatred or aversion, because fear can also be included in that too, because of the link between anger and fear, and hatred and fear, and the delusion of a separate self, in which the two former always arise. These three are known as the kleshas, and they are pictured at the center of that wheel of life in three sort of theriomorphic or animal forms. The snake for aversion or hatred, anger, the cockerel for greed, and the wild boar for delusion. That's the way that they are shown. And nirvana is the extinguishment of those. So basically peace, which is the peace at heart, which is what nirvana means, that peace, equanimity, and so forth, that peace at heart is seen as being synonymous with the blowing out of the passions. That is, that the energy of the passions, the life force that inhabits the passions, are no longer the slave of the delusion of I. So I'm making this point because it's really important not to mistake nirvana with some kind of unfeeling, cold, aloofness to life. If you've ever met people who've been deeply involved in Buddhist training, and particularly if they are, well attained, there is a great vivacity, a great liveliness and warmth of heart about it. And the Buddha himself, was known not just for the clarity of his wisdom, but also the warmth of his compassion and his goodwill, the metta and the karuna. Goodwill and compassion that he exuded, and with which which was why he spent 45 years of his life teaching other people the way out of suffering. So the realization of nirvana are these four foundations, or these foundations of mindfulness. Now, again, we've used this term mindfulness before many times. Personally, I prefer the term awareness. Mindfulness was a term that was coined in the late 19th, early 20th century. I think it was early 20th century as a translation, because mind was seen as something cool and very rational. Here in the West, here in the English-speaking world, reason and rationality was highly valued. It was seen as being raised up and above the instincts and the impulses and the passions themselves, and so it tended to be used. But actually, in the original Buddhist context, these things are not so separate, and so mind is what we use to think with. That's what we associate. We think with our minds, but we feel with our hearts. And actually, the original Pali Sanskrit word is chitta, Citta, is how it's spelt in Romanized letters. And chitta actually doesn't have an exact translation into English, but it involves not only the place where thoughts arise and memories arise and volitions arise, but also where the seat of the emotions also rise, what we would call the heart. So quite often you will see either heart being used as a translation now. And in some cases even heart-mind, heart-stroke-mind in this. So it's the seat of consciousness, if we can say consciousness has a seat. It's the place where we experience all these things. That's what's being referred to. So so what we're looking at is that these four foundations are, if you like, a map of this heart. So all of this transformation from delusion to clarity, to wisdom, and from self-regard, selfishness, and so forth, to compassion and openness, and so forth. This transformation takes place not somewhere else, but actually in chitta. So chitta, for our purposes, for this sutta, is mapped as having four regions, and these four regions are these four foundations within which the development of what is called awareness or mindfulness, the term is sati in Pali, takes place. So there's work to do, obviously, and this is why we're in a training. This is why what the Buddha is giving us is a training and development plan, if you like. He's saying this is what you need to do in order to attain nirvana and thus come to the end of suffering. So hence why the Buddha talks of the soul way, and this term, the way, is really important, not only in the early Buddhist texts like the Pali Canon, but also when Buddhism went through to China, because China already had this notion of the way. They called it the Tao. And there's the religion Taoism, and the practices around Taoism, that there is a way of things, and that there is a way to be walked as well. And in the Buddha's notion, there is also this way to be walked, and this is why the Buddha tells the parable of the raft, where a man is stuck on one side of a river, of a raging torrent. There's no bridge, there's no ferry. How is he going to get across to the other side where there is safety? So he has to build a raft, and this raft is built of wood and rushes and leaves and so forth, and he places the raft onto the river, and then he, exerting himself with his hands and his feet, he sails across over to the other shore where there is safety. And the Buddha was pointing out that this is what our training does. It helps us navigate across this river of life from samsara, the realm of suffering and desire and delusion, over to the shore of peace and nirvana at the end of it. So, and the method that we use for this, what the raft is made of, is just this: meditation, mindfulness, precepts, wisdom practices, and so forth, and the devotional practices as well, which are many. often the term referred to is 84,000. 84,000 of them. So there is a path, there is a way of things, and this is why we talk of the Buddha's path. It's why we talk of the middle way. It's why we talk of the Arhat path, or later the Bodhisattva path, way, journey. Here we have it. And so our path of exploration in this sutta takes the form of these four foundations. What are these four? He says, herein a monk dwells practicing body contemplation on the body. So body contemplation on the body. So that's interesting, because why does he say body contemplation on the body? So the contemplation is a function of the body. The object is the body also. So what we're seeing here is as it were an alternative way of describing what ordinarily we would use the pronoun I. So normally when we think I have to meditate or I have to be mindful of the body, no. Obviously that can't be, because the Buddha has already said that the notion of I is a delusion. So clearly there is contemplation. So if it's not I contemplation, what is it? It's body contemplation. Body contemplates body. And then he says ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful. Ironically, that term ardent actually comes from the old French meaning to burn. And one of the terms for the kleshas, for the passions, is the fires, the three fires. So it would seem to be the very opposite here. But actually ardent is a fire, not that burns wildly like the passions, but is very focused. And when it becomes focused in this way, then it can become very useful. As we know, you can cook with fire, you can warm yourselves with fire, but you don't want that fire to rage out of control and burn the house down. So that ardent is not just to burn, but it's energy that is applied in a very focused way. So when we read that ardent, I think we can usefully consider it to mean wholehearted. It's not wishy-washy. It's not half-hearted. It's not inconstant. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it can be bothered and sometimes it can't be bothered. It has a focus, it has a consistency, it has a vector. Ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful. So there is this curiosity, there is this looking into or listening into or leaning into, and not being distracted from that. It gives a real sense of what that function of sati feels like when we're applying it. Having overcome covetousness and grief concerning the world. So the covetousness and the grief are referring to the distracting thoughts. Covetousness, that's wanting something else. Oh, it's not working fast enough. Maybe this isn't the right way. I can't concentrate on this because I was upset at something that happened earlier today. All those things, which we know, anyone who's done a meditation practice will know that these thoughts that arise take us away from the object of meditation. So there is that fierceness that is in that wholeheartedness is necessary. That ardent heart is necessary in order to overcome these things, this covetousness and grief. He dwells practicing feeling contemplation on feelings. Ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having overcome covetousness and grief concerning the world. He dwells practicing mind contemplation on the mind. Ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having overcome covetousness and grief concerning the world. You can hear this repetition. He dwells practicing mind object contemplation on mind objects, ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having overcome covetousness and grief concerning the world. And those are the four foundations. So we have body, we have feeling, we have mind, and we have mind objects. These are the four sectors or regions within which the function of sati is going to be developed fully. And so basically what the Buddha is saying is that sati itself, although it is a function within humans that we all have to some degree, it doesn't just develop automatically. We have to apply ourselves and deliberately train it in. And if we do that, then it begins to function in the round. It begins to function fully. And in this way, then it becomes something that is useful for us in walking this path towards Nirvana. Well, we'll leave that there as the setting for today, and we will begin to explore those 4 foundations in more detail in subsequent talks. Thank you.